Hello, my name is Justin Decloux, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to the Important Cinema Club. And today we're talking about Jerry Lewis. And I have across from me one of the Jerry Lewis experts in the whole known world. And so this is really important. I can ask him a question that's been bugging me my entire life. Is Jerry Lewis funny?
There are no easy answers to that question. That's a question that I think has been plaguing us Jerry experts for years. And one of the things about Jerry's scholarship that draws us to it, I think, is trying to get to the bottom of that question.
And so we're mostly going to be discussing Jerry Lewis's films that he made in very close proximity to each other. Cracking Up, also known as Smorgasbord, that came out in 1983.
Great movie.
The last film that Jerry Lewis directed and starred in.
Yep, that's right. Went out with a bang. He did direct a short film after that later, a short UNICEF film called Boy. I encourage you to look it up if you're a Jerry completist. And
we're also going to be talking about King of Comedy, which is probably Jerry Lewis's most well-rounded performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's no cracking up, but it's okay.
So Will Sloan, other than being a Jerry Lewis expert, and now I can say that Will Sloan is obsessed with Jerry Lewis, because I was at his apartment recently, and I picked up an old issue of Positif, probably around the early 80s, late 70s. And it was in French, and I went, Will, you can't read French. Why do you have this? And he said, what did you say?
I think I said, I know, but I like to know it's there, and that if I learned French, I could.
But why did you have that particular issue?
Well, you see, I don't know which issue you're talking about right now, because I have maybe 4 or 5.
But they all have Jerry Lewis articles.
Yeah, I'm collecting them, and I have them on my table, and I know that they're there. And one of them is Which Way to the Front is on the cover, and that just tickled me to no end.
Which is one of Jerry Lewis's final pictures.
Yeah, one of his later, and not one of his most beloved films. And it just tickled me to no end that the French took it so seriously. They put it on the cover of Positif. There's another one that has Cracking Up on the cover.
So it's like these magazines are holding treasure, and the key will be learning the French language.
Yeah.
And that once you get that key, you'll be able to find these riches.
I might also eventually I'm going to be so curious. It's going to drive me so nuts. I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to write them, and then I'll feed them into Google Translate. And then I think through that, and maybe through a French-English dictionary, I'll be able to piece together what they're saying.
So what would be your first experience with Jerry Lewis? Now, if someone's listening to this and they don't know who Jerry Lewis is, why did you click on this podcast? Unless you're my mom.
How does nobody know who Jerry Lewis is?
Well, that's a good question, because when you ask someone these days and you're like, if you ask a 12-year-old, who is Jerry Lewis? Do you think they would give you any answer?
I think they might say, "Oh, Cracking Up! I love that movie."
So no, they would not answer.
We watch that. I have my friends over, and we have a sleepover party, and we watch Which Way to the Front. I think they would tell you.
So, what was the first movie that you saw that starred Jerry Lewis?
I believe it was The Caddy, which was one of the several. Or many, I don't know. One of however many movies he made with Dean Martin. Mm-hmm. I think that every Blockbuster in the country actually had a copy of The Caddy, because Paramount put it out on VHS. Mm-hmm. And I saw The Caddy, I don't know, 500 times.
So it was like the go-to VHS that you went to over and over again?
Yeah, and as a kid, I loved Jim Carrey, I loved Jim Varney, I loved any comedian who was sort of wacky and made funny faces.
So it wasn't your parents that pushed you in that direction, it was more
I suspect that my parents might have suggested it to me. I think my parents wanted me to have some tolerance for the classics or black and white stuff.
Which is funny, because I believe you told me before that your mom has no love for Jerry Lewis at all.
Well, yeah, I'm not. Listen, I can't tell you why they got me to rent The Caddy. I know that I did drag my mom to see when I was 8 or 9. We went to see Damn Yankees,
which Jerry Lewis was co-starring in.
That's right. He started it on Broadway, and then he did the roadshow tour. And I dragged my mom to see it. One of the great nights of my life. And she was converted after that. She said she hated Jerry Lewis for her whole life, but after that night, there was this whole weird interlude where he just sort of did a stand-up routine halfway through the show, kind of unprompted, and he kept saying jokes like, did you hear the one about the nearsighted vampire who bit Dolly Parton in the neck? Huge, you had to have been there. Huge laughs. And Mom came out of it saying, oh yeah, he's a real old pro, a real...
She appreciated his professionalism.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a funny thing, because King of Comedy is kind of all about that, as far as Jerry Lewis as an entertainment figure, because, I'll be the first one to say that he's not funny in that movie, and he's never trying to be funny in that movie.
He's sort of funny on that one part when he strangles Robert De Niro. You remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
But other than that, like, there's no, like, big gag moments, which, for people that know Jerry Lewis...
He's also funny when he says, "So did Hitler!" Which he apparently improvised.
So, King of Comedy, for people that don't know, is a film is directed by Martin Scorsese, stars Robert De Niro, and Robert De Niro is a kind of delusional comedian who idolizes...
Wannabe comedian.
Comedian, yeah. Because he's not even a comedian.
Yeah.
Who idolizes a talk show host played by Jerry Lewis, who is also named...
Jerry Langford.
Do you think
clever bit of casting.
I think they had the name first, and they're like, we need some kind of Jerry Lewis figure for this.
I wouldn't be surprised. They offered it to Johnny Carson first. So maybe it was Johnny Langford at one point.
And Jerry Lewis is so controlled in this role, which is probably the most surprising thing. Because his personality, I'm currently reading one of his biographies written by Sean Levy. It's called The King of Comedy, coincidentally. Probably on purpose.
Yeah.
And,
great book.
And it's really great, but you get a sense that Jerry Lewis, as a person, was not easy to deal with as far as ego and attention-seeking went.
Right.
Like, him as a personality, like, you've read about him more than I did. Like, he was almost, like, obsessive in his need for people to pay attention to him, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, the sense that I get is that, he had vaudevillian parents, including a guy, his father, Danny Lewis, who was sort of a poor man's Al Jolson. And they were always on the road all the time, and Danny Lewis always seemed sort of like condescending to his son.
Especially, and they would like abandon him and like leave him with like his grandmother and go off on the road. And it's interesting because not only did he want the attention from his parents, but when Jerry Lewis himself got famous, like his parents wanted his attention and they wanted to ride off his coattails, but they were still really cold to him in the way that they treated him.
Right. Even though he was like maybe the most famous man in America at one point.
Which is almost insane, is that, like I mentioned that question before, that like you could ask a 12-year-old, like, do you know who Jerry Lewis is? Well, in the 1960s, like, everyone knew who Jerry Lewis was.
Yeah.
What does that appeal, do you think? Like, what, like, made Jerry Lewis so popular?
I mean, I don't want to sound like armchair psychologist here.
That's what we're here. We have a podcast.
I mean, this sounds like so hack when people say, well, it was the 50s and it was after the Second World War and America just needed to laugh. He was just taking a needle and he was blowing that balloon. That's right. 50s culture was so conformist, right? Leave it to Beaver, and along came this guy.
An anarchic spirit that was just smashing all the rules.
But I mean, really, there had never been a comedian like Jerry Lewis, someone who was that out there. I mean, it was like, Lou Costello or something. But...
Well, did you find, because like watching a bunch of his movies for this podcast, and I got to be completely honest, that I don't think I saw a Jerry Lewis film till I got into like university.
Yeah.
And when I was reading lists of like, these are movies that you should see, so I watched like Nutty Professor and Ladies Man.
And you loved them.
Yes, I did. I mean, Jerry Lewis is a filmmaker is something we should get into a little bit later.
You laughed your ass off. You were like, Jerry is so funny. You
know what? I have to admit that even watching movies, even Cracking Up, the movie that his last film did bring some laughs to,
Yeah, mostly of like the kind of unintentional or the...
No, well, Jerry...
There were several laughs in Cracking Up for sure.
Jerry Lewis, it's weird because his comedy is not a very precise one in a lot of his slapstick. It's a very chaotic one.
But then at times it is very precise.
It is very precise because reading that biography, one of his... For years, his early gig was doing pantomimes or lip syncing to records. Mm-hmm. So there's a precision that needs to be there. Mm-hmm. While later on, his physical act would be like, knock everything over in the room.
Yeah, and like there's a great scene in The Patsy when he keeps knocking over vases and he keeps like catching them just as they're about to hit the floor.
Oh, a real Jackie Chan move.
Yeah, or just some of the things like the typewriter bit that are sort of like...
That he was famous for, which is that he would be listening to a typewriter and he would be miming it at the same time that it was happening.
Yeah, where it's sort of, it's like beautiful in a way. It's like almost like a ballet performance. Yeah. Or Cracking Up has one of my favorite scenes in any movie, which is the opening credits where he keeps pratfalling over and over again in the office because the floor is so...
slippery.
Yeah.
So we could also talk about Cracking Up. So the plot of Cracking Up is... is Jerry Lewis, who looks so old. Like, it's kind of... Actually, he probably...
And he certainly doesn't hide it because he's wearing, like, these like, weird suits with polished loafers and sweater vests.
Well, Jerry Lewis always prided himself on being very well dressed.
Yeah.
Do you think it's weird that we always say Jerry Lewis? It's very rare that anyone says Jerry.
I say Jerry all the time because I feel so close to him.
But cracking up, he plays a man who's feeling suicidal, so he goes and sees a psychiatrist to try to deal with his feelings, and a bunch of skits show up. Some skits follow each other, some skits come out of nowhere.
Like there's one point where he talks about his French ancestors, and then all of a sudden it's, what is it, 15th century France, and that leads to a lot of great scenes of Jerry like speaking in his fake French voice.
You have to remember that when Will says great, he usually means not good.
I didn't say that.
And this is a good point, a good time to bring up the fact that Jerry Lewis, which has become a running joke in like cinema circles, was huge in France.
Yeah, he actually was. That's not, I mean, he probably isn't anymore.
No.
Unless, they've re-released Cracking Up recently.
But Cracking Up, when it opened in France, wasn't it number one?
It was actually a success, as were most of his movies. Even these dregs, these late period ones. And, all the French critics really did love him.
Cracking Up had actually a really weird pass to release because it was made, and then he screened it for the studio, and the studio went, "We're not releasing this."
Yeah, they tested it.
Yeah.
And for some reason, audiences were not into this movie, even though just a few years before, audiences had briefly made Hardly Working, an inferior film, I would say, the number one movie at the box office.
That's almost unbelievable.
Like if you watch Hardly Working, it's like, was this number one at the box
like,
office?
was it just the dregs that week? Like there was nothing playing?
I don't know. Or maybe America was just still filled with people like me, just Jerry fans who were waiting 10 years for the next Jerry movie.
But Jerry Lewis went on to act in a bunch of stuff later on. But back to King of Comedy, which he somehow made the same year as Cracking Up. Which is almost...
Even though they seem they were filmed in separate universes.
Cracking Up looks like it was shot in the 60s.
Yes.
Like the film stock and the way it's filmed on these cheap sets, like...
The acting style.
Yeah. Milton Berle shows up dressed as a woman.
Hilarious. Sammy Davis Jr. is in it.
Playing Sammy Davis Jr.,
Yes, that's
I
right.
believe.
And you can tell that his scene was filmed, like, completely at a different time as the rest of the scene because it's just this weird close-up and the background is different.
It's like they caught Sammy Davis coming out of a apartment building somewhere and like, "Hey, Sammy," and they just put cameras on him.
There's a great blooper in the end credits when he picks Sammy Davis Jr. up and he says, "Thanks to the NAACP for my Lifetime Achievement Award."
Oh, boy.
Good stuff.
So, do you think Jerry Lewis's material has aged well?
It's kind of like hard for me to even know what it was like at the time.
Like it must have felt so fresh compared to...
I guess. I know that there were a lot of critics, obviously, in the 60s after he... Like, even in the 60s, the French love of Jerry Lewis was like a massive joke. So he was already a bone of contention at the time. I assume it's aged somewhat.
Well, when does the Three Stooges come out?
They were like the 30s to the 50s.
So, but Jerry Lewis was just doing stuff that the Three Stooges did, but... Like, they were doing slapstick, right?
Yeah.
But how was it different from what they did?
I think it was just the level of energy that he brought to it.
Like, the more of the anarchy that was brought to the stage?
Yeah, and I mean, the best way to get a sense of what Jerry Lewis might have been like at the time is to watch him and Dean Martin host the Colgate Comedy Hour, which was a variety show in the 50s, sort of like Saturday Night Live, where they were alternating hosts of the show with, like, I think Bob Hope and Abbott and Costello. And you can kind of get a sense of what they were like in a live setting at the time, just constantly breaking the fourth wall.
But do you think that Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, like, the only way they could have been successful was coming up together where they had that interplay between both of them?
I think so, yeah.
So Jerry Lewis could not have existed by himself and become a success by himself. He always needed Dean Martin to create that attention before he could move on to something else.
I think it probably, like, Dean Martin probably helped audiences get used to the idea of Jerry Lewis. And, the fact that after Dean Martin left, even though Jerry Lewis remained successful for a long time, his critical stock really plummeted, I think, because there's something about Jerry Lewis that's so embarrassing for people who watch him. I mean... there's nothing cool about Jerry Lewis. Like, he really is... His stuff really is unpleasant to watch at times.
It's
and
like
having Dean Martin there makes it easier to take.
especially when he's like bouncing off Dean Martin.
Yeah, and Dean Martin can always kind of rein him in, you know, when need be, which Jerry certainly could not do.
No, Jerry, especially in Cracking Up, because while I gave you a kind of idea of the plot of Cracking Up, it just kind of
There is no
devolves
plot,
into anarchy. At one point we were watching and we were like, there was no joke in that scene, and then it just cut to something else.
Yeah, I mean that's what's great about Jerry. He's constantly causing you to redefine your notions of like what is a joke.
What is cinema?
Like there's a great scene. I keep saying that over and over again. It's a great scene, but this really is a great scene, guys. Every scene in this movie is great.
It's not great.
If you're a Jerry fan, you have to be dogmatic at some point. And
it's like you're writing for Cade Cinema or something like that.
Like
you take a stand.
You've got to love Jerry unconditionally if you're going to love him at all. But there's a scene in the movie when Jerry, for some reason, is at a diner and there's a waitress there and she's like, what do you want to drink? Do you want coffee? Do you want espresso? Do you want cappuccino? Do you want... And she lists like 20 options and he chooses one. And then she says, okay, for your main course, do you want eggs Benedict, eggs... You know.
Time itself is the joke.
Yeah, and there's no punchline to the scene. It just kind of draws out.
But having just watched a few Jerry Lewis movies, that happens all the time. Like it happens in Cinderfella, where he has to go from one end of the table to the next over and over again. Or in The Errand Boy, he has to go get candy and go up
and like it drives you nuts. Like it's like painful to watch after a while. I mean, part of me thinks that Jerry must know what he's doing with that because, you know, a man who has devoted his life to comedy
has to have an idea that like laughs must be generated from that.
Yeah, and like with that scene of Cracking Up, or the scene where he's getting the candy and the errand boy, it's like he knows that like within 5 seconds we already know what the joke is. He's beating it and beating it and beating it.
But it's the classic Simpsons and the rake gag. Like if you do it a bunch of times, it's not funny, but then it becomes funny and then not funny and then it becomes funny again.
And that's what's great about Jerry, because like for the whole thing you're not laughing. So he really broke new ground.
But in The King of Comedy, that's all that it's about. Like, The King of Comedy is ostensibly a comedy. Like, it is funny, but it's that uncomfortable kind of funny.
Yeah, like Ricky Gervais.
Ricky Gervais and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because Robert De Niro, as a comedian himself in the movie, I remember The Dissolve recently did a week of talking about The King of Comedy, and there was a whole forum about, is Rupert Pumpkin, Robert De Niro's character, funny in the film?
Yeah.
And my question is like, does it matter?
Yeah, I actually think his stand-up thing at the end, the way they do it is just so brilliant. The fact that he is like just funny enough to pass. He's
okay. Like he's not embarrassingly bad.
Yeah. The jokes are sort of hacky, but they're jokes and they have beginning, middle, end, and they have punchlines. And his delivery, like he's mastered the cadence of a stand-up act, but it's just a little bit. It's like he's never done it in front of an audience before, so it seems a little bit too rehearsed.
But Jerry in the movie of King of Comedy, he never really gets a moment where he goes for those laughs. Like he does in his other films.
If you check the DVD, there is a deleted scene that's Jerry Langford doing a monologue on his show, and it's wisely deleted because it is really not funny.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I would put it up against Pupkin's monologue and as being like, you know, you could put them neck and neck and try.
Maybe that's why it was in the movie that when Pumpkin's monologue appeared compared to Jerry.
Pupkin. You're like the people in the movie who mispronounce it over and over again.
Oh, that's the gag. I'm doing a little bit here. Oh, that's what you have to go with.
Sure.
I'll be calling him Rupert for the time being. But Jerry Lewis, like when I was watching it, I was just shocked, even rewatching it for this, how restrained he is. Like the entire film is that he's not doing his character, he's not doing the voice or being the kid at all.
He's so opaque, actually. Like there's something about him that. You know, anytime that he's not on stage or he's not on in a way, like when he's walking down the street and talking to cabbies and stuff, he's kind of on. But when he's not on, and, you know, when Rupert and Sandra Bernhard have kidnapped him, he feels it's almost as if he's saying, you have no right to get any of me.
Yeah, it's like these people are beneath me. Yeah. So I'm not going to give them anything.
Yeah.
And that is such an interesting way to approach that character, because you would have think, knowing Jerry Lewis, he would have gone for like the meaty thing, like the thing that he could really sink his teeth into, and because it's so opaque, that doesn't really exist in the movie. Like there's never that big moment where he gets to deliver like a huge monologue.
Well, there is the monologue that he delivers, you know, when you're doing a show like mine.
Yeah, you're under a lot of pressure, and
the incompetence.
Yeah. But it's not like a big, like, showstopper, really.
Right.
And supposedly he improvised that monologue.
Which I believe, because his use of the word incompetence.
Really?
You know, the incompetence. You'll never know if you're there I can't do the bit, but...
But Jerry Lewis was known as not only a workaholic, but kind of like an evil taskmaster when it came to...
Yeah.
Which, it seems almost ridiculous because of the bits that he would construct, that there would need to be so much energy and precision that comes to them. Because Jerry Lewis wrote a book about filmmaking called The Total Filmmaker. He taught classes in universities about filmmaking.
Yeah, there are some clips online of him teaching those classes, if you can find them. Yeah.
Which is, I don't know, compared to like the work that he put out to his ego and how he perceived himself, he always famously...
How dare you?
He always famously said that he wanted to really adapt Catcher in the Rye.
Well, there was the famous interview that he did with Peter Bogdanovich where he said, "You'll never see a more Holden Caulfield kind of guy than this guy sitting right across from you."
They're all phonies, all of them.
And he wanted to play Holden Caulfield even though he was in his 30s at the time.
I think that Jerry Lewis could have pulled it off.
I would give anything to see.
Like go to an alternate dimension where he made The Catcher in the Rye in his 30s. That would be like he contacts J.D. Salinger and he's like, J.D. Salinger's just like, I've been waiting for this call. There's only one man who can play Holden Caulfield, and that's Jerry Lewis.
But listen, I could talk all day about Jerry. What I really want to know is hear what you think about him.
About Cracking Up?
Yeah, about Cracking Up.
Well,
you loved it.
Cracking Up was a film that Will said, like, oh, I want to do a podcast. And because I knew Will's love for Jerry Lewis, I was like, what movie do you want to do it on? And Will was like, oh, we need to do it on Cracking Up. I'm like, what's that? He's like, it's Jerry Lewis's last movie. And then he started doing Jerry Lewis's voices, and then we watched it. And
there's a bit of revisionist history in that account, but go ahead.
I was like, what is this movie? I actually compared it to Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce's classic. And is it is Finnegan's Wake a classic? Does anyone read it?
I mean, I think people have read it. I trust people when they say it's a classic, yeah.
And because it's almost incomprehensible. And Inland Empire, David Lynch's... I think that was his last movie that he made, wasn't it? He hasn't done one in ages.
Last feature-length film, at least, yeah.
Mostly because Cracking Up is just all over the place. Their skits don't really have connective tissues. Suddenly we'll cut to this or that. And I'm like, what is going on?
But that's what's interesting about the movie is... Jerry, in his self-directed work, had been kind of exploring this aesthetic, let's call it, of kind of a free association, you know, a thin clothesline of a plot that just goes into a bunch of
like he shows up as a bunch of characters. He plays like a gangster. He plays
constantly like playing with the reality of the movie.
Whoa, A.K.A. cinema writer just walked into the room and is trying to explain Jerry Lewis right now.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying it's what it does.
And I do like the kind of style that Jerry Lewis brings to his movies, which are really like over the top and in your face. Basically like a Mad Magazine version of comedy.
There's no kind of internal logic there, which is probably like to their fault, depending on how you view it. I mean, it's also one of the things that makes him interesting, the fact that he's so... kind of not bound by anything. And what would you... if someone said, like, I don't know who Jerry Lewis is, he's some comedian, like, isn't he parodied on The Simpsons? Sure, purest fantasy. Everyone loves Jerry, but go ahead.
He's the biggest... he's bigger than he's ever been. One of the most surprising things, before you answer the question of what you would recommend, is how is Jerry Lewis still alive?
I don't know, probably eats well.
His hate and spite keeps him alive.
I'm kind of hoping he never dies. I want this to...
Would you rather, like, Jerry Lewis at your funeral is like, you know, they used to say that the heroes died before their fans, but now the fans have died before their heroes.
I mean... if Jerry Lewis is at my funeral, I'd be honored. I don't know why he would come.
You heard this podcast.
Finally, someone gets me.
Do you think that? I mean, like, who's talking about Jerry Lewis now? Do you think he types into, like, Google? He has, like, a Google alert?
I guarantee he... well, actually, I don't think he does, because there was a long time ago when I tried to interview Jerry Lewis.
Oh, really?
For NPR, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And...
ooh, NPR.
Yeah, I know, right?
Wait, what was the reason for this?
He had a PBS special at the time, like an evening with Jerry Lewis or something, and that was going to be my excuse. And his office didn't have an email address. I had to phone it, and the secretary there gave me a fax number that I was to fax an interview request to. And
so you couldn't even talk to him directly.
Yeah, and the interview never happened, unfortunately.
But now that he's heard this podcast...
Well, the thing is, he might not hear this podcast because I'm not confident he has the internet.
Or a computer.
Yeah. I mean, I know that he is like in real life as a pack rat who like keeps all of his media clippings.
Mm-hmm. So you'd think that he would go out and get the stuff like on the internet.
I would think he would have an email address, but maybe not.
Because like one of the most, last big articles written about Jerry Lewis was a Vice article that had the very inflammatory title of, I think, is like Jerry Lewis is still a piece of shit.
Yeah.
And treats his audience like crap.
Yeah, something like that. Which is at the top of the Google search if you Google him.
Really?
Well, it's on the first page at least.
Because, not only is Jerry Lewis still alive, he's still doing live shows.
Yes. And, obviously he's not doing pratfalls like he used to. He kind of comes out and sits on a chair and he'll show, like, comedy bits. And then there will be a long Q&A where people ask him questions and he sort of, insults them.
That's probably the saddest thing that I've ever had. Have you been to any of those?
A few years ago, I went to his 86th or 87th birthday event. At the Friars Club in New York. It was at the 92nd Street Y. He did an interview on stage with Richard Belzer, our Jerry Lewis.
I don't know who that is.
And
don't you mean Joe Piscopo?
Well, Joe Piscopo was in the audience, which I was starstruck. You have no idea how excited I was to see Joe Piscopo.
If anybody doesn't know who Joe Piscopo is, he's a famous...
Everyone knows who Joe Piscopo is.
Star of Dead Heat.
Dead Heat, great movie. It's still cracking up.
But anyway, so you went to the show.
Yeah, and there was a huge, there was a long Q&A at the end, and it was really funny. I do remember that one person brought up the movie Slapstick of Another Kind, and Jerry said, I always get a bit embarrassed when that movie that was mentioned comes up, because... and he went off on a whole thing, and I felt really sad because I love Slapstick of Another Kind.
Do you like Slapstick?
No, I mean, it's awful. It's one of the worst movies ever made.
So if I was a Jerry Lewis, novice, and I don't know where I would have heard of him or why I'd be interested in
Probably from all the billboards that his face is on now.
So, for example, I'm your mother. We just got out of Damn Yankees, and I'm like, well... I'd like to see some more Jerry Lewis movies. Is your mother going to listen?
My mother is 90 years old, evidently. Well, first of all, to my mom, I would say don't watch any more Jerry Lewis. Cash your chips now. It's never going to get any better from here. But after that, you see, I think The Nutty Professor probably gets kind of the sweet spot between the weird self-aggrandizing / self-loathing Jerry of his kind of freeform movies and the kind of professionalism of his Frank Tashlin movies.
And for people that don't know, Frank Tashlin is probably the ultimate Jerry director of Jerry, other than Jerry himself.
Yeah, he started out doing Looney Tunes cartoons, and then he became sort of a director who the French critics like. And among other things, he directed Cinderfella, Who's Minding the Store. Lots of great movies.
Probably the most famous one is Artisan Models,
yes,
which is a Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis picture. What did you say? So, Nutty Professor, why do you think that one hits that sweet spot for you?
I think it has most of the things that I like in Jerry Lewis, which is the extreme performances, the kind of weird psychodrama that's playing, because Jerry plays a dual role in the movie of the nerdy Professor Kelp and his alter ego, the slick, some say Dean Martin-ish, Buddy Love. And you can really see, it's kind of the same psychodrama that plays out on the telethon every year.
I've never watched any of the telethon. What do you mean,
Well, it's like on the telethon, he's kind of like the same slick, unctuous character that he plays in The Nutty Professor. But at the same time, he's Jerry Lewis, so he can't help but be kind of a goof.
So he's trying to be cool, but he can't help himself to get kind of goofy and break that mold.
Yeah, and, so many of Jerry Lewis's movies are about this conflict that I assume is semi-autobiographical, which is wanting to be loved by other people and also wanting to love yourself.
And he doesn't know how to express himself other than being that goofball or like that kid.
Yeah, and maybe he spent so many years being the goofball that he felt the need to overcompensate in some of his public appearances by being kind of the intellectual.
Do you think that creates a kind of distance from the character that he plays in his movies? Or what do you think is the real Jerry Lewis? Is there a real Jerry Lewis anymore? Or is that gone to,
I think
like,
we
to
all
the
have
real
to,
Jackie Chan?
We all have to look into our own hearts to find the real Jerry Lewis. I don't think it's for me to say what the real Jerry Lewis is.
Well, if Jerry Lewis is listening right now...
Write in and tell us, who are you, sir? What is the real
What would you do if you got a phone call, like, tomorrow from Jerry Lewis being like, well, I heard your podcast.
I would first of all say, I love you. I can't believe you're talking to me right now. This is such an honor.
Or he shows up at your door.
If you shut my door, oh my God.
Would you have like a heart attack?
I would invite him in. I would offer him coffee.
He's like a vampire.
I would show him the Which Way to the Front poster that's above my bed.
What if he was like, I want you to burn that picture?
Then I would.
He's like, I want you to kill a man.
I would do whatever he told me to do.
Because he's like, I mean, we can't talk about Jerry Lewis without bringing. He's like, I got a little something to show you here, and he has like a VHS of The Day the Clown Cried.
Oh my God, I'd be in heaven. A private screening at my apartment with Jerry Lewis of The Day the Clown Cried.
But what if when you're watching it, like he won't stop the shtick? Like he's like, hey ladies,
that even better.
And you're like, I'm trying to watch the movie.
I'm not one to second guess Jerry.
What do you think is this fantasy that has kind of built up around The Day the Clown Cried? For people who don't know, The Day the Clown Cried is a movie that Jerry Lewis made, which is about him being a clown during the Holocaust.
And he like leads children into the
gas chamber.
Yeah.
But like there's a mystique that's grown around it. When people talk about films that like haven't been seen or have been locked away, people always talk about The Day the Clown Cried, which seems a little bit nuts to me because there's a million Jerry Lewis movies out there that people aren't watching.
I mean, this one has a pretty out there premise.
Yeah.
And the fact that they started filming The Day the Clown Cried when they didn't actually even have the rights to the script. So one of the reasons it never came out was the screenwriter saw the movie and was like, no way, this is a disaster. Because Jerry kind of changed it to being, well, allegedly changed it to being less kind of the dark drama that it used to be and more of a kind of Chaplin-esque thing about a sad clown who redeems himself, I guess. I don't know.
At the end,
Jerry, feel free to write in and
by killing the kids with laughter.
If I could have seen this movie to research, I would have. And yeah, it just seems like sort of the ultimate manifestation of what we saw in the telethon every year, which was like Jerry as martyr.
Mm-hmm. He used to host a telethon all the way through, didn't he?
Yeah, until the later years when he got...
How long was the telethon in its prime?
It was like 21, 22 hours.
So how would we look at the end? I've never seen these telethon clips.
There are famous moments halfway through the night when he would like be addicted to Percocet and he would say like weird things. Like,
really?
Like there's this amazing clip online where he's like, I wanna send a message to all you pushers out there who are making money on drugs anyway. Wouldn't you like to give some of it to a worthy cause? If I can get a kid out of a wheelchair, I don't care where I get the money. And these are like, sleep deprived things.
But off of Jerry Lewis, which he's amazing, as we've talked about, on to Martin Scorsese. It's who
Not
directed King of Comedy. King of Comedy is almost a weird like entry in his filmography because stylistically it's a little bit difficult to place, don't you think?
Yeah, it has less, moving camera. It's a very static looking film.
I remember reading online that he said he was inspired by like silent films when he was making the movie.
Oh,
and
interesting.
I don't see it at all. Like I was looking for that when I was watching the film because there's a little bit of his style, whether it be in the editing or like a little camera move here or there, but it's just very confined.
I sensed also kind of an inspiration from network television of the time.
Oh, really?
Well, I sense it just because that's the milieu the movie takes place in. Also, because the movie has such a kind of dry sense of humor, it makes sense that the style is understated.
Because of that. And supposedly Scorsese was very sick when he was making the movie. That he just got off Raging Bull and was super exhausted. I feel like he was probably still in his coke days, because after King of Comedy, he went into After Hours, which is probably the most energetic film.
I think he might have actually recovered either before or after Raging Bull from his drug addiction. I don't know.
That's right, because he was in the
if
hospital.
Martin Scorsese is listening to this, please feel free to write him.
Because he was in the hospital,
yeah,
and De Niro brought him the novelization for Raging Bull,
yeah.
And he was like, please, I want you to adapt this, as opposed to bringing him like the novelization of Jerry Lewis's life, and he was like, please adapt this. But Jerry Lewis's life has been adapted in TV film form, hasn't it?
Oh, well, yeah, 10 years ago there was the Martin and Lewis TV movie starring Sean Hayes as Jerry Lewis and another guy as Dean Martin.
And how did it, in your estimation, live up to the story?
Well, I haven't seen it since it aired. I remember finding it perfectly watchable. I have never... For a TV movie about Martin and Lewis starring Sean Hayes, it really hit the right notes.
Do you think there's a story in Jerry Lewis's life that you feel could be told? Because, like, the thing about biopics is no one wants to see someone's entire life. That just cannot be summed up in one film. But if you're going to pick, like, one moment in his life to adapt for film, what do you think is the most interesting?
I think I might pick The Making of Cracking Up, because I would love to see that dramatized. I would love to see, like, the behind-the-scenes discussion during all the choices that were made in that film. I would like to see, like, whoever's playing Jerry Lewis to, like, reenact him, like, high-fiving everyone on the set after a particularly funny joke.
Sitting on the crane and, like... talking to the bullhorn.
Yeah, like as we see in the end credits.
Yeah, it was in the end credits of Cracking Up, there's a real Jackie Chan style bloopers.
Yeah.
Because if anyone Jackie Chan was really inspired by was Jerry Lewis.
Sure.
I don't think he's ever said that in his entire career.
Well, I think Jerry's influence touches everyone, kind of in the way that a star does. But I think if I were making a movie out of Jerry Lewis's life, I think The Day the Clown Cried could potentially be interesting, because he was sort of at the height of his drug addiction at the time.
Oh, was he? What was he addicted to?
Percocets?
Yeah,
for his bad back.
Well, that's right, because didn't he hurt his back in 1965 or something like that?
Somewhere
he took a fall on live TV, I believe. Mm-hmm. And ever since, I thought it was going to be some like exciting drug like crack cocaine or something like that.
Sorry.
The goofiest of all drugs.
I mean, the sad thing about The Day the Clown Cried is it doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah, but then you could have like a flash forward. Who would play?
A flash forward to like hardly working opening, and he's back on top.
Number one at the backstop. Like Tim Burton makes like the Jerry Lewis story in like an Ed Woodian style.
I think I would much rather see like kind of a Mike Leigh version of it, like
really?
like Mr. Turner. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds a little bit rough as far as Jerry Lewis adaptations
I would
go.
love that. Yeah.
So it would have to go in the
or maybe like an Abel Ferrara one, like Pasolini.
As far as King of Comedy, you've actually said that it's your favorite Martin Scorsese picture.
Yes.
Why is that?
Oh, well, I mean, listen.
Even beyond Jerry Lewis.
These judgments are incredibly subjective.
No, of course.
I mean, it's one that just resonates with me personally for so many reasons. It combines so many things that I'm interested in, you know, celebrity culture and the art of comedy. And, you know, I think it has Robert De Niro's best performance.
Really? I think it's... Watching it again, it's a fascinating performance where looking at the Robert De Niro of today, it feels like that person could never give the performance that he gave in King of Comedy.
Well, it's amazing. Like, it's a performance that's so smart about the craft of comedy. Like, when you see his act at the end, to deliver an act that's that close to being an actual funny comedy routine, but not quite, but hits all the right notes. Like, he clearly really studied comedy. And one doesn't, you know, one never gets the sense of Robert De Niro just in his interviews and his other performances that he actually knows as much about comedy as he showed, you know, in that movie.
So you see, he learned all that and then just ejected it afterwards. He's like, I don't need to.
I don't know what he did. I just, and you know, just the way Rupert Pupkin acts in that movie, in this kind of grandiose showbiz way. It's a way that I don't think he's really brought to any of his other performances.
Mm-hmm. And like Martin Scorsese, like you said, he's not that show-offy in the way that he directs that film, which helps it resonate. Because if he did go into like after hours kind of craziness, I don't think the movie would work as well as it does. It's that kind of staticness gives it that uncomfortable feeling.
Like Pupkin is such an absurd, like kind of showbiz creation. This guy who's modeled himself after TV, and kind of thinks that the repartee on talk shows is how people actually talk, and have this kind of absurd creation in the middle of a movie that's otherwise very calm and static. Like if the movie were sort of hyperactive around him, it would be too much. The movie has to be like a foil to him.
Yeah. I was actually surprised at how the uncomfortableness builds and builds and builds in the movie, and then it's almost the ending kind of rushes through it, and there's almost no speed bumps. Like, Rupert seems in control the entire film as it goes along. Like, he knows how this is going to end. This is what he wants to do. He knows he's going to go to jail.
Yeah.
And then the ending, which is like fact or fantasy, whichever way you
I think it's fact.
Yeah.
I think the people say they think it's fantasy because like they want it to be fantasy.
But why would it be fantasy? Like there's no reason for it to be.
I mean, the fact that Sandra Bernhard is never mentioned in any of the news clips at the end.
Do you find that a little bit weird, or?
I mean, it's something that I've heard said for a reason why it might be fantasy. I don't think it's all that weird because it's not like she was on TV.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most important thing,
yeah.
is that he was on TV and people saw who he was.
And the fact that the fantasy sequences get harder and harder to distinguish as the movie goes on could lend some credibility.
But you could just be like, the whole ending is a fantasy sequence.
Yeah.
Like, I've read a lot of like articles that are like the fact that his name gets repeated over and over again at the end in the final monologue he does as the camera kind of pushes in. It's like,
I question like how long the Rupert Pupkin cult would actually go on after his arrest. But I don't know, maybe it could go on.
But like, you just look at people who are famous just for the sake of being famous today. Like, do you feel that the movie has some impact in like today's day and age? Like, does it still have the kind of same, feeling with the internet and all that stuff?
I mean, the movie sort of straddles different eras because Rupert Pupkin is kind of like, he seems to be modeling himself off the Bob Hope kind of Jack Benny era of show business.
But in like the less literal sense, like the celebrity obsession and stuff like that. Like,
yeah, I mean, in that way, the movie is very prescient.
Even today, like we can, fans have to live through those things instead of just like it being a part of their life. And by I mean apart, I'm moving my hands for you podcast audience away as opposed to being something that they have to live with all the time. Because fandom now is something that you define yourself by. Like, I am a fan of Star Wars, as opposed to being like, I like Star Wars. A lot of people who are super fans define themselves by those things, just like you define yourself by Jerry Lewis. And wasn't we didn't mention Sandra Bernhard at all during this podcast, but didn't she have in King of Comedy? She and Jerry Lewis hated each other, didn't they?
Yeah, which I think is like appropriate. I mean, like they're such diametrically opposite schools of comedy. I mean, Jerry Lewis seems to be a well-known misogynist.
Yeah, that's right.
I believe he's quoted as saying women aren't funny.
Ugh. And Judd Apatow famously won an award for, I don't remember what it was, but he something for like feminism or something like that, and he put it in the air and he was like,
"Take that, Jerry Lewis." It's like
kicking like a
he doesn't care whose toes he steps on.
He's kicking the 92-year-old when he was down.
Yeah. I love those scenes between Jerry Lewis and Sandra Bernhard because to have someone like Jerry Lewis, who's by this stage of his career is the establishment comedy figure, and then to have Sandra Bernhard, who's this kind of weird, sexually ambiguous downtown comedian.
Yeah, it's such a weird contrast, especially that he's not even really reacting to it. He's kind of like stone face, duct taped to the chair.
She's actually sort of like what Jerry Lewis was in the 50s.
That's what I was going to say.
This real destabilizing figure who's kind of anarchic and who, doesn't fit into our conventional notions of comedy.
And you think he looks down on that? Like he can't take a step back and see? Because Jerry Lewis was famous for like walking into rooms, like cutting ties and like spilling drinks on people and like mussing their hair. And then Sandra Bernhard's doing that when he's like in his 50s.
Yeah.
And he's like, ugh, I hate her.
I mean, listen, I don't want to say that Jerry Lewis might have a problem with women, but I'm not saying that's not a factor.
This shit just got dark.
So of the Jerry Lewis movies you've seen, like, what has been your favorite?
Probably The Nutty Professor.
Sure.
Just because, I mean, it's such an easy pick because the contrast between him being the professor and Buddy Love is so fascinating. But even then, it's still kind of that awkward filmmaking always makes me take a step back and be like, huh, like, that's a weird choice that he made there, or, you know, that cut doesn't quite work, which is weird considering, like, the way he talks about filmmaking in his book, The Total Filmmaker.
He really positions himself as, like, a perfectionist who,
Yeah.
like, labors at the editing suite and...
Make sure everything is perfect.
Yeah, when you look at his movies and, like, there are so many just glaring flaws.
Yeah. Or just, like, mistakes where you're like, what? How did that get through?
But the mistakes are, like, so intense that you sometimes wonder if they're intentional. Like he almost creates a whole new film grammar in some of his self-directed movies.
Like Cracking Up?
Yeah, like Cracking Up.
But as far as earlier films, or even Dean Martin and Jerry, because you didn't even mention any Dean Martin or Jerry Lewis films as your favorites. Is that because that's what you...
You know, I think they work better in a live setting when you see them on the Colgate Comedy Hour. Like, when they're kind of put into just kind of a standard formula plot, like a service comedy or something, it dulls what made them special, which was kind of like the anarchic
that they were kind
quality.
of coming in and kind of breaking apart.
Yeah. But a lot of those Dean and Jerry movies are like very watchable. Artists and Models is probably the best one just because it has all the weird Frank Tashlin touches.
I was going to say that Jerry Lewis, when he did his stuff with a real Hell's a Poppin', and didn't he do a remake of Hell's a Poppin'?
He did Hell's Poppin'. I don't know if it was on Broadway or if it was bound for Broadway. I know that it was not very successful.
Oh. Have you seen the movie Hell's a Poppin'? Like,
the Olsen and Johnson movie?
Yeah.
I have not, no.
That is probably the craziest, like, classic comedy film that I've ever seen.
I would like to see it, yeah.
So, as we're nearing the end, do you have any other thoughts on either Jerry Lewis, Cracking Up, and The King of Comedy, other than that they're all classics?
I mean, I think I would just add that Jerry Lewis is a genius and that the French were right.
When did you believe that Jerry Lewis became a genius? Like,
I think he was born into it, obviously.
No, that you did. That, like, you went, you know what? I'm obsessed with this person.
I think it was probably when I grew up with Jerry Lewis, and then there was probably a fallow period when I only saw him once a year on the telethon.
Yeah.
But then when I was in first year university, I rented Hardly Working on VHS from Suspect Video.
It was Hardly Working that got you off?
It was because I read Roger Ebert's 0-star review of it, and I was like, oh man, I gotta see this. And that movie, like, words can't even do Hardly Working justice.
Well, how does it compare to Cracking Up?
I mean, it's a little less professional than
Wow, really?
the Cracking Up is. It's like shot on a really low budget on these kind of like depressing Florida locations, it's kind of Cracking Up takes place in Jerryland in this really kind of artificial movie like setting, but Hardly Working, it really just like looks like a sad old man like in some Florida exteriors trying to be funny.
Him trying to react in a real world doesn't really work when you don't have like giant King Kong hands coming in and grabbing people and stuff.
Yeah,
like
I mean it's debatable whether or not that worked in Cracking Up.
But I mean, Cracking Up does have at least imagination behind it.
Yeah, and you know, Cracking Up is like Jerry's movies of the 60s, is aiming at this kind of like highly artificial alternate reality with a lot of bright primary colors and just sort of a surreal dreamscape atmosphere.
Which you don't understand, maybe you're not supposed to understand.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a cognitive dissonance in Hardly Working between kind of the performance style and the style of comedy and the kind of bleak reality of the settings. Also, there's a scene in Hardly Working that's a Saturday Night Fever parody.
Oh man,
where it's like Jerry in the white suit with the hair, and there are no actual jokes in it. It's just like Jerry trying to dance like John Travolta.
It's just really sad.
It's one of the darkest things I think I've ever seen.
So, who would you say today is the Jerry Lewis of our generation?
I think Jerry Lewis is still the Jerry of our generation. Like you can go see him at a state fair somewhere, and you'll have a good time.
Filled with some room filled with grannies and
downtown film programmers.
So, do you think Jerry Lewis could have a resurgence? Like Quentin Tarantino takes him for a movie and...
I mean, at this stage, I don't... I mean, he's a little old for that. Although he is in one of the upcoming Nicolas Cage films.
Is he?
He's in a movie with Nicolas Cage and Elijah Wood coming out next year. I think it's called The Trust. And, I've always thought that imagine if Jerry Lewis played the Jack Nicholson role in The Departed.
Yeah.
I think he would have been amazing.
Well, did he play a lot of gangster roles later on in his career? Because didn't he do it on TV?
I don't know. I
think he was
on
Wise
Guy,
Guys.
and then he was in the movie Cookie with Peter Falk, which I've never seen. Yeah, there's something kind of like gangsterish about him.
Well, he loved to talk about how he would have association with gangsters, didn't he? Two things he loved talking about.
All those...
How much sex he got and how much association almost to like distance himself from his personality on screen.
There's a story that Jerry Lewis tells on like almost all of his interviews now where he talks about his friendship with John F. Kennedy. He says, there's a rumor going around that John F. Kennedy, my friends, was stooping Marilyn Monroe. And I know that that's not true. That's malicious gossip. And I know that because I was making her.
Wow.
And he says that in interview after interview now, and it's like really unsettling. I don't think anybody knows how to respond to that.
Do you just picture that in your head when he says it?
Well, I like to picture like old Jerry Lewis having sex with Marilyn.
The corpse of Marilyn Monroe? Or like...
No.
On you like young, some like it hot Marilyn
Yeah,
Monroe?
yeah.
He somehow went through a time
Come to
travel.
daddy.
I'm coming at you. We're cracking up. Well, I think probably the best final summation of Jerry Lewis is
he's a genius.
Is at the end of Cracking Up. He comes out of the movie theater.
Oh, man.
And so Cracking Up ends with him leaving the movie that we just watched, but it's under its original title, Smorgasbord.
Right. So the joke already doesn't work. and then he's there's a big audience lined up to see the movie, as of course there was in real life, wherever it shows.
Mostly on TV, where it was originally released.
And I don't know, maybe he's in France. Who knows? But the people in line keep saying, "Oh, how was the movie? How was the movie?" And he says, "Oh, it was really good. It was," and then it fades out.
Yeah, he starts talking about his movie, and it literally just fades out to credits and bloopers.
But I love that Jerry saw the movie that we were watching, and then he came out and he was like, "Oh yeah, it's really good." It's a bit cocky to put that at the end of your movie.
But you know what?
I mean, he was right.
Because Jerry Lewis is a genius, like you said.
Yeah.
Even if you're not really laughing.
Well, it's like what Jean-Luc Godard said when he was on the Dick Cavett show. Dick Cavett asked him if he finds Jerry Lewis funny, and Godard said, "Oh yes, he is funny. Even when he is not funny, he is more funny." And that's very much how I feel about him.
Okay, well, my name is Justin Decloux, and you've been listening to the Important Cinema Club, and I've been talking with
Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening. Go watch those Jerry Lewis movies.
Don't put that in the podcast. Please cut that out.
I can't. Anyway.
No, seriously, cut that out.